Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive socio-political case study on how an empire actually falls. We're looking at one of the oldest, most recognizable narratives of rebellion in human history, the story of Moses, Pharaoh, and the Exodus. But listen, we aren't just looking at this as a traditional story. We're going to analyze it as a literal masterclass in systemic collapse. We'll be exploring the intense social tensions between the Egyptian empire and the Hebrew people, that raw, visceral struggle for power and freedom, and exactly how a seemingly invincible status quo was systematically dismantled piece by piece.
Just look at this opening quote for a second, because it perfectly sets the stage for our entire analysis of absolute power. On the surface, Egypt in 1520 BC looked totally unshakable, right? But, as the source material points out, the empire's tightening grip wasn't a sign of strength at all. It was actually a glaring broadcast of its own internal terror. The state was absolutely terrified of the growing population of the exact same people it relied on to do all its labor.
To map out the exact architecture of this systemic collapse, we're going to move systematically through 5 key phases: the architecture of oppression, caught between two worlds, the spark of rebellion, dismantling the status quo, and finally, the cost of liberation.
All right, let's jump right into Phase 1, the architecture of oppression, and specifically, the illusion of order.
There's this incredibly stark disconnect at the very heart of this empire. On one side, you have Pharaoh's ultimate operating philosophy, which is basically that order is everything. To him, silence equals control and control equals peace. But that quote-unquote peace is entirely funded by the never-ending suffering of the Hebrews. The state literally crushed bodies just to break their hope. It is a classic socio-political powder keg waiting to go off. And that brings us to Pharaoh's brutal decrees. Throwing infants into the river wasn't just random, senseless cruelty. It was a highly calculated attempt to enforce systemic fear. When the state noticed the Hebrew population growing, extreme paranoia set in. This infanticide was a desperate, state-mandated demographic control tactic meant to maintain the invisible walls of the empire. It just proves that the empire knew its power relied entirely on keeping the oppressed too broken to ever organize. Which brings us to part 2. Caught between two worlds. This is really the making of a revolutionary.
Moses is such a fascinating psychological case study here. He literally had to physically and mentally strip away that illusion of control he picked up in the palace. He's raised as a prince, taught to just command without feeling, but when that social tension finally snaps, when he steps in and kills an Egyptian slave driver to protect a Hebrew, well, the palace is definitely no longer safe. Fleeing to the desert as a fugitive becomes vital. He's stripped of his titles, unlearns the language of power, and ultimately transforms at the burning bush into a man totally prepared to tear that old world down.
This quote hits the nail on the head regarding the exact psychology of the oppressor that Moses was indoctrinated with. Egypt's ruthless logic takes. That is the defining trait of an extractive empire. You either assimilate and learn to desire what the state wants, or you suffer the consequences. For sure, Moses had to completely break this psychological conditioning in the desert before he could even fathom challenging Pharaoh.
Let's move into Section 3, the spark of rebellion, where the state officially gets challenged. Notice how this isn't just some abstract spiritual awakening. It is a direct, vocal validation of the Hebrews' suffering, and that is what ignites the rebellion. The source text highlights these very specific words: I have seen, I have heard, I know. Think about it. In an empire where the ruler literally demands silence, simply acknowledging the pain of the oppressed out loud is a radically destabilizing act. It lays the whole moral foundation for the uprising.
So what happens when the empire faces the slightest pushback? Well, it absolutely doesn't negotiate. It doubles down on economic and physical punishment. Moses goes in with a relatively modest initial demand to just go into the wilderness for 3 days. And Pharaoh's retaliation? He removes the raw materials, the straw, but demands the exact same brick quota from the workers. It's a classic authoritarian reflex, right? Squeeze the laborers harder to show them that resistance only brings more pain.
Pharaoh's terrifying response here reveals the incredibly fragile ego of an autocrat. He equates his personal will with the actual fabric of reality. When Moses disrupts the workflow, Pharaoh doesn't see it as a basic labor dispute. He sees it as an existential threat to reality itself. I am order. So by his logic, to defy him is to invite total chaos. And it's exactly that rigid inflexibility that sets the entire empire up for a catastrophic fall.
Okay, Phase 4. Dismantling the status quo. Let's look at the plagues as targeted, systemic strikes. This is where it gets incredibly strategic. If we reframe the plagues from just being mere miracles into targeted systemic strikes, you see how they utterly bankrupt Egypt's economy and logic. The poisoned water, it instantly paralyzes the state's primary resource. The hail and locusts systematically obliterate agriculture and the food supply. The darkness targets their psychological control, literally stripping away the empire's ability to even see or coordinate. And through all this, Pharaoh goes from hardening his heart to feigning repentance, to making these desperate little deals, and finally, to absolute panic. His kingdom is dismantled asset by asset.
And check out this detail. It's a literal geographical and social splitting of the state. The oppressed are structurally separated from the collapsing state apparatus. The source highlights that while the Egyptian elite are totally paralyzed in a darkness that can be felt, the lights over in Goshen, the slums of the oppressed, stay on. The state can't even protect its own citizens anymore, let alone project power over its underclass.
You can just watch Pharaoh's whole facade crumble here. His shifting, frantic reactions prove that his absolute power was honestly nothing more than a performance. First he says, "Who is the Lord?" Then he's suddenly saying, "I have sinned, pray for me." He starts bargaining. Okay, just the men can go, and then, okay, take the kids, but leave the livestock. As the state's leverage evaporates, so does his authority, until literally all he has left is a completely powerless threat to Moses, saying he'll execute him if they ever meet again. The illusion of order is completely shattered.
Finally, we reach Section 5, the cost of liberation, characterized by this concept of organized haste.
Because dismantling a system is chaotic, but building a new one requires intense, organized discipline. Look at these strict, precise instructions for the Passover. Amidst the total chaos of Egypt's final collapse, the Hebrews are given a hyper-specific protocol. They aren't just running away wildly, they are executing a synchronized departure, marking doors, eating specific foods, and doing the whole thing fully dressed with their sandals on.
I mean, tonight is haste. Do you feel it? The palpable tension in that instruction really emphasizes that freedom from an empire isn't something you just casually walk into. It has to be urgently seized. There's literally no time for the bread to rise. The window for liberation is incredibly narrow. So when the architecture of oppression finally cracks, you have to be dressed, packed, and moving before the dust even settles.
So, the systemic collapse is finalized. And notice the empire doesn't just magnanimously let them go. They are completely, fundamentally broken, physically and economically. Pharaoh, the guy who once demanded absolute silence and order, is reduced to literally begging his own slaves to rise up and get out. Plus, the narrative specifically notes that the Egyptians freely hand over their wealth as the Hebrews leave. It is a total 180-degree inversion of the power dynamic. The state hasn't just lost its labor force, it's been totally bankrupted.
I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder about the fragile psychology of power, and really, the unstoppable force of a united push for freedom. As we've seen throughout this explainer, the Egyptian empire looked totally invincible from the outside, but underneath, it was held together by nothing more than fear and violence. Once the oppressed saw right through that illusion and simply refused to play by the empire's ruthless logic, the collapse wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the anatomy of liberation. Keep questioning the systems around you, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.